Well, thank you all for being here. Permit me to begin by thanking the Mathias Corvinus Collegium for inviting me to address the opening of the academic year at its Transylvania campus. I'm especially grateful to Minister Balázs Orbán and Ms. Dora Such for and their colleagues for their warm hospitality, and all the dignitaries here, thank you as well. I've spent enough time now in a car with the minister and some of his colleagues that I feel confident in delivering my speech in Hungarian. No, I'm kidding, no. I do want to talk to you about the gift of normality, how precious it is, how fragile, how well-deserving of your best labors in defending it. And I will try to weave these thoughts into an immigrant's tale, namely my own. An immigrant isn't supposed to complain about the society that gave him refuge, and that is what I am. An immigrant, a radically assimilated one at that. I spent the first 13 years of my life in Iran, a nation many in the West associate with traditional backwardness, with black hijabs and dour clerics, severe mores and teeming multitudes who fill the streets on Fridays to pray and to chant, "God is great." As a boy growing up there, I had already absorbed this judgment and made it my own. I blamed all that ailed my native land, its repressiveness, the double thinking and double living that they engendered on our hidebound traditions. And I almost thought I was an American before I ever set foot in the United States. I spoke English fluently with an American accent I had picked up from the movies while still enmeshed in the Ayatollah's Iran. And I'd concluded in my heart that what was Western was best, and Western meant secular. It meant individualistic. This was the height of rationality. By contrast, the atmosphere in Iran, as you can imagine, was stultifying. Islamic conformity was informed on pain of flogging, judicial amputation, even hanging. Desperate for an escape, Iranians of my parents' milieu, middle class, educated, urbane, sought escape in the things the mullahs reviled the most: American movies and US cultural arrogance. But I took this love of American culture further than most others did. In the dream worlds of Stan Lee and George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and the like, I glimpsed a world of possibility. A problem presented itself to the Hollywood hero, who then, through ingenuity, pluck, or sheer physical might, overcame it. In the Western imagination, moreover, the individual mattered as an individual. Again, by contrast, the emblem of the Iranian sensibility in those years was the young boy who, during our war with Iraq, had strapped himself with grenades and dashed under an incoming enemy tank. To earn his spot on giant murals around Tehran and have his story recounted on state television, the model boy had consummated his devotion to nation and regime in this one irrevocable act of self-negation. Can you blame me for preferring Indiana Jones and Luke Skywalker? No, America, or at least the America on display in Reagan-era cartoons and movies, was my true promised land. I pictured it as a sort of decadent 1980s Manhattan. That's what I wanted, that's where I belonged. Of course, when we finally did immigrate to the United States, the actual experience initially frustrated this dream of hyper-secularity and hyper-individualism. My mother and I had our green cards in hand. My father never left the old country, and we boarded a KLM Royal Dutch Airlines flight from Tehran first to Amsterdam and then across the ocean. As I followed the flight path on the tracker projected on the front of the airplane, I was puzzled that we didn't land anywhere close to Manhattan. Instead, the plane flew all the way to a place called Minneapolis, St. Paul, but we didn't stop there. We then took another plane, this time to a place called Salt Lake City, Utah, but we didn't stop there. Next, our family members who had helped us obtain those green cards came to pick us up, and they drove us to a town called Eden, Utah, and there was a sign as you drove in announcing population 600. We were now at the heart of Mormon country, It was a deeply culturally conservative place with a communitarian rather than individualistic ethos, a product of the Mormon religion, which of course struck me as abominably weird. And if I had rejected Shiite Islam with its rich philosophical tradition linked to Plato and Aristotle and the bloody pathos and iconography of its martyrs, I sure as hell wasn't going to sign on to a religion that taught that the ancient Israelites had traveled to America, tried to convert the native Indians, and recounted their travails on golden tablets translated using magic seeing stones by a Latter-day Prophet named Joseph Smith in upstate New York. Nevertheless, in the long term, postmodern America fulfilled its promise of radical individualism and self-definition to me. I soon left Utah, and in the years to come, I would revel in the chance to remake myself anew each day. My moral opinions were as interchangeable as my clothing styles and musical tastes. I could be a high school hippie, a college socialist, a law school neoconservative, a this, a that. And all along, it outraged me to recall that there were people still trapped in societies that didn't permit such experiments in self-definition. But lately, my mind has taken an unexpected turn. When I soberly examine our society as it really is, I find much wanting in its worldview and way of life. And more than that, I've come to believe that the very modes of life and thinking that strike many people in the West as antiquated or limiting can liberate us, while the dream of a world without limits or barriers is a prison. The quest to define ourselves on our own drives those who seek after it to a kind of madness, that maximal individual autonomy and self-definition can't be treated as the highest goods of a sane society because they finally would destroy normality. What, you might ask, prompted this change of mind? To answer that, I have to tell you about two people. Both of them happen to be named Maximilian. The story of the first Maximilian begins in Poland before World War II and reaches its climax at the Auschwitz concentration camp. Maximilian Kolbe, a resident of that camp, today ranks among the greatest of modern Christian martyrs. The church recognized him as a saint in 1982, and each year, as you know, thousands of pilgrims flock to the punishment bunker where the Nazis murdered him. I suspect most of you know the outlines of the tale, so I won't dwell on it at great depth here. He was, in short, a Franciscan friar who lived a life of intense missionary activity before he was arrested in 1941, owing to his anti-Nazi activities. One day in the summer of that year, a prisoner escaped from Father Maximilian's block, and the camp authorities carried out their usual protocol in response to an escape, selecting 10 men to die of starvation as collective punishment for the one who had gone free. The priest wasn't selected, but when he heard one of the condemned men cry out, "My wife, my children," Kolbe took off his cap and stepped forward from the line and volunteered to take that man's place. After 2 weeks, Father Maximilian was the only one of the 10 still fully conscious when the camp authorities entered the bunker to finish the job. The camp worker later recalled seeing the priest, quote, "with his eyes open, his head drooping sideways, his face calm and radiant," end quote. I was 31 years old, on the cusp of becoming a father and a Christian when I first learned the story of Maximilian Kolbe. The story of why I chose to become a Catholic after spending nearly 2 decades as an atheist is too long to recount here. The saint, it seemed to me, had climbed the very summit of human freedom, and he did this by denying and overcoming, with intense resolve, his natural instinct to survive. And this apparent surrender became his triumph. In that time and place of radical evil, he asserted his moral freedom and radiated what it means to be fully human. This form of freedom is at odds with the account of freedom that prevails in many societies today. Plenty of people still carry out acts of great sacrifice, to be sure. Witness the heroism of physicians, nurses, and other frontline workers in response to the novel coronavirus pandemic. But the animating logic of the West, the intellectual thrust of our age, if taken to its conclusion, renders the actions of a Kolbe insensible. We can't make sense of it. Our version of freedom says that to be free means to just be able to select how we live from the widest range of options. Our goals are self-gratification and well-being, usually defined in material, utilitarian terms, and we are free to the extent of being unhindered to pursue the life we think will gratify us best. Our conception of freedom can't make sense of a vast range of ties that bound traditional nations, folkways and folk wisdom, family loyalty, unchosen religious obligations, the nation itself, even the very notion of the common good. Which brings me to the second Maximilian. That's my son, today a bubbly 4-year-old who lives with us in Manhattan, yes, the decadent Manhattan of his father's dreams. America has fulfilled his promise to me and then some. I'm a member of the global creative class, able to move anywhere, work anywhere, party anywhere, or at least before the pandemic. I enjoy greater moral choice than any of my ancestors could have imagined. In the United States, if I so chose, I could declare myself a woman, insist on being called Sabrina, and my subjective state of mind would suffice to make it so. More mundanely, I could abandon my aging mother in a nursing home and abdicate all the duties that are entailed in being an Iranian son, without anyone thinking the less of me for it. An immigrant isn't supposed to complain about his freedom, yet as I grow into my faith and to my role as a father, I tremble over the prospect of my Maximilian growing up in an order that doesn't erect any barriers against individual appetites, and if anything, goes out of its way to demolish existing barriers. The fear has been with me ever since my wife and I were expecting our first child, but it found concrete form when we took a subway ride in New York when Max was 1, and plastered all over the subway were ads for a dating site, an online dating website, promoting kind of the most extreme sexual content you can imagine. Now, I've spent most of my life in large cities, and I know that prudes will never exactly belong in New York City. Still, I couldn't help imagining my Max turning to me, if he were a little older, to ask, "What does this stuff mean, Dad?" No doubt, I could have come up with an answer. What alarmed me was the banality with which these ads treated one of life's most intimate dimensions. It was that corporate banality, not even the vulgarity, that stuck with me. What messages were these ads communicating? The conclusion I drew from that incident and many others of the kind seemed inevitable. The United States, such as it exists today, enshrines very few substantive ideals I would wish to transmit to my son. Now, Max's existence is a product of the very barrier-dissolving impulse that animates modern America. Only in America, as they say, could an Iranian-born journalist meet and marry a Chinese-born architect, a union that would eventually produce a son given the delightfully Habsburgian name Maximilian. But no amount of gratitude can allay the anxiety that grips me when I ask myself, what kind of a man will contemporary liberal culture chisel out of my son? Which substantive ideals should I pass on to him? My nightmare for my Max isn't that he will become an absolute failure in life or, God forbid, a drug addict or something like that. The way our economic arrangements work, chances are he will inherit his parents' upper middle class status. Rather, the nightmare is that he will become the kind of soulless global meritocrat without any kind of serious commitments or purpose. One of these young men who date a girl for more than a decade but with no intention to marry, much less have children, who can only talk about money, who has missed out on all of life's deepest blessings, all of which involve a degree of self-denial and a willingness to accept irrevocable obligations: marriage, fatherhood, care for elders, patriotism, kinship with neighbors, including and especially the poor. A young man, in short, who couldn't figure out why a priest would lay down his life for a complete stranger in a death camp. More immediately, I'm afraid that he will use all of the normality and freedoms that even I took for granted, the normality and freedoms that drew me and my parents to the land of the free. Forget the supernatural sacrifice of a Maximilian Kolbe. My Maximilian's ability to grasp the merely natural is under threat today. Schools across the United States are adopting so-called critical race theories that frame all white people, all the majority, and even increasingly Asian kids as irredeemably racist, and all black students as permanent victims. Radicals have been toppling statues of certified American saints and heroes in a frenzy of insane iconoclasm. Not even Abraham Lincoln is safe. They are slandering the very idea of the nation and denuding our public squares of all history and historical memory. Many parents I know, even in liberal Manhattan, are struggling to shield their children from sex education curricula that marinate 9-year-olds in content that would be shocking for grown-up adults. We are altering our very language to accommodate the most extreme gender ideologies, and daily, hitherto sane institutions enshrine madness as dogma. The latest is the use of the word pregnant people to refer to pregnant women. We laughed and mocked and raged at this, but soon it made its way into the pages of the Washington Post and official statements of the US government. The idea, of course, is that men can become pregnant, so by saying pregnant women, you are oppressing these men who become pregnant. This is the stuff of dystopia, yet it's our reality. No, we don't face torture for rejecting these insanities the way Orwell's Winston Smith does in 1984, but the institutional triumph of insanity and untruth is real, all the same. And for many people, the threat of being unpersoned on the internet and losing their livelihoods and their social life is enough to do the trick. They mouth the untruths, or at least they keep their mouths shut. Note how all of these developments came in the name of liberation, of tolerance, of overcoming the inconvenient and oppressive limits imposed on us by nature, by family, by tradition, by patria. In the ongoing sexual revolution and gender ideology, we see this with special clarity, how the promise of total liberation ends paradoxically in the loss of true freedom. If the last few years have taught us anything, it is that there is no neutrality. One way or another, some orthodoxy or other will be enshrined in our societies. The only question is whether that orthodoxy is a mad and unreasonable one, like the hegemonic ideology of the rainbow countries, as Prime Minister Orban calls them, or whether it is a reasonable idea, the humane, classical, and Christian tradition that celebrated reason and indeed insisted that reason itself, logos, was with God and is God and became man. And so this is the challenge before you today as students of the MCC and as students in this region. By all means, seek economic development. By all means, seek technical expertise. By all means, seek technological prowess. By all means, chase after merit and meritocracy. But, and forgive me if it's presumptuous of me to advise you, remember that in the bargain of development and self-improvement, you don't have to cashier the values of this region, the residual but irrepressible Christian culture, family, historical memory, normality. Normality is precious. Normality is a gift. And in our times, normality is under systematic attack from ideologues, and therefore she calls us to her defense. Don't underestimate what young but committed elites can do in a region like this one. I wish you every success in your new academic year. Thank you very much.